Under the burning sun of August 1305, the streets of London filled with restless crowds, waiting to witness a spectacle that promised not justice, but terror. The man they had come to see was no ordinary criminal. He was William Wallace, the defiant Scottish rebel who had carved his name into the heart of England's nightmares. Captured at last, betrayed by his own, Wallace was delivered to King Edward I, who wanted more than his death. He wanted a lesson carved into the flesh of a man who dared to defy the crown. Dragged from the Tower of London, Wallace's body was tied to a rough wooden hurdle. His naked flesh pressed against splintered boards as horses pulled him through the filthy streets. The roar of the crowd echoed off the stone walls, some jeering, some silent, but all unable to look away. Dirt, rocks, and refuse were hurled at him as he was pulled along. His body scraped and bloodied before the execution itself had even begun. For Edward, this humiliation was deliberate. The rebel would not walk with dignity to his death. He would be dragged like a beast, stripped of honor, of humanity, piece by piece. By the time Wallace arrived at Smithfield, where the execution was to take place, he was barely recognizable as the towering figure of resistance. But even bloodied and bound, he did not beg. His silence cut deeper than words, his defiance clear in the eyes that glared at his captors. For Edward, this defiance could not be allowed to live. What followed was not an execution. It was theater, crafted to destroy a man's body while breaking the spirit of a nation. The hangman prepared the noose, tying it roughly around Wallace's neck. The crowd pressed forward, waiting. With a jerk, the rope pulled tight, and Wallace was lifted from the ground, his chest heaving, his face reddening as the rope crushed his throat. The people watched as his body convulsed, the great warrior kicking helplessly, caught between life and death. And then, just when the darkness nearly closed around him, the rope was cut. His body fell, gasping, alive. This was not mercy. This was cruelty. Wallace was not to be granted the relief of death. He was to suffer. The executioners dragged him to the block where the next stage awaited. Before him, knives glinted in the sun, the tools of disembowelment. Wallace was strapped down, his chest heaving as the blade pierced into his abdomen. The pain was unimaginable, the knife cutting deep, his own body betraying him with every scream. The executioner reached inside, pulling out his intestines, slow and deliberate. But worse than the pain was the spectacle. The organs were tossed into a fire before Wallace's eyes, the smoke rising as the stench of burning flesh filled the air. Every moment was designed to strip him of humanity, to make him not just die, but dissolve into horror. Yet still, Wallace did not cry for mercy. His screams filled the air, but his voice carried no submission. For Edward, this silence was dangerous. A rebel who begged could be forgotten, but a rebel who endured could become legend. So the knives worked deeper, stripping the man of everything that made him whole. His entrails burned, his body broken, yet his will refused to bend. Finally, the executioners brought the ordeal toward its inevitable end. Wallace was beheaded, his head lifted high before the crowd. But death was not the end. His body was quartered, hacked into 4 pieces, each limb claimed as a grim message to those who might dare rise against the English crown. His head, tarred and spiked, was carried to London Bridge, where it stood as a warning to all who crossed. His arms and legs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling, Scotland's land marked with the remains of its greatest champion. For Edward, it was meant to be a victory. Wallace was gone, destroyed, his body scattered across the kingdom. But the lesson he hoped to carve in fear became something else entirely. The people did not forget. They whispered his name, not in terror, but in reverence. His death was no defeat, it was martyrdom. This was the end of William Wallace, executed not just to silence him, but to break a nation's spirit. Yet the brutality that killed him only strengthened his legend, transforming a man into a symbol of resistance that no executioner's knife could destroy. But martyrdom has a strange power, stronger than fear, stronger than death. What Edward thought would be the end of Wallace was only the beginning of his legend. Scotland, though scarred and trembling under the iron fist of English rule, found itself unable to erase his memory. In villages and castles, around fires and in whispers, his story spread. The tale of the man who endured humiliation, torture, and the most brutal death imaginable without surrendering his spirit became a seed of defiance. Mothers spoke of him to their children, reminding them that freedom was not a gift but a burden carried on broken shoulders. Warriors looked to his memory and swore that no matter how heavy England's sword, Scotland would never kneel willingly. In Wallace's silence, his refusal to beg for mercy, there was a message sharper than any blade. That courage could outlive flesh. Even beyond Scotland, the brutality of his death was remembered. Travelers spoke of the spectacle they had witnessed in London, how Wallace's head glared defiantly from London Bridge, how his limbs dangled as warnings across the kingdom. Yet, rather than silencing rebellion, these grotesque trophies revealed the fear of the crown itself. What king must dismember a man so completely, if not one terrified of his memory? Edward's attempted dominance had created something he could never kill. Wallace's name became woven into ballads, carried in songs that disguised rebellion as melody. Farmers hummed his story in the fields. Soldiers recalled his valor as they sharpened their swords. And though Wallace was gone, his spirit lingered in every heart that still longed for freedom. For the English, the gruesome end of Wallace was a lesson in power. For the Scots, it was a vow that no rope, no fire, no knife could sever their will to fight. His scattered body became a map of resistance, a grim reminder that Scotland itself was divided, yet waiting for the day it would rise whole again. Wallace had fallen, but his death had not crushed Scotland, it had lit a fire. And that fire would burn far longer than Edward ever imagined. In the years that followed Wallace's death, Scotland's fight for freedom did not vanish, it roared back to life. Men who had once wavered, who had feared the might of England, now looked to Wallace's sacrifice as a reminder that one man's courage could spark the will of an entire nation. His martyrdom became the fuel that carried forward the wars of independence. Robert the Bruce, who would later rise as King of Scots, was among those whose path was shadowed by Wallace's example. Though Bruce's journey was marked with betrayal and struggle, the vision of Scotland as independence kept alive. By Wallace's story drove him toward the decisive Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. That victory, though years after Wallace's execution, carried his spirit onto the field. In every strike of the sword, in every cry of freedom, Wallace's defiance lived on. For King Edward I, the execution had been a warning carved in blood. Yet history remembers him not as the conqueror who silenced rebellion, but as the tyrant who created a martyr. Wallace's name stands taller than Edward's crown ever could. His end, horrific, cruel, unrelenting, became the cornerstone of Scotland's national memory. It was proof that a body can be broken, scattered, and burned, but an idea cannot. Even today, centuries later, Wallace is not remembered for how he died, but for why. His courage became immortal not through victory on the battlefield, but through his refusal to surrender to injustice, even in the face of unbearable torment. His death is heralded not as a defeat, but as a rallying cry that freedom, once fought for, can never be forgotten. The execution at Smithfield was meant to erase him. Instead, it etched his story in fire across the pages of history. And though the streets of London have long since changed, though the wooden hurdles and gallows are gone, the echoes of the day remain. The execution that was meant to destroy a rebel instead created a legend. This was the brutal death of William Wallace. Tortured, humiliated, executed but never defeated, his sacrifice became Scotland's strength. And his legend reminds us that even the darkest cruelty cannot kill the human will to be free. If this story gripped you, imagine what's still hidden in history's darkest corners. Subscribe to Torture's Room and step deeper into the shadows of the past, where every execution, every punishment, reveals the chilling truth of how far humanity has gone in its pursuit of power.